On the evening of March 20th, 2003, US and British troops swept into Iraq. Operation Iraqi Freedom had begun. For months they had been poised for action, while the politicians argued whether invading Iraq would be a just war or not.
Iraq is now in further material what terrorists or terrorist states could do with chemical
are working, and other means should not be
constitute an axis of evil. It's a danger to the American people, and we got to deal with him.
The invasion was supposedly launched to rid the world of the threat from Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, to fight terrorism, and as an added bonus, to topple a brutal dictator. But as television images of the rapidly escalating conflict were flashed around the world, increasing numbers of people began to question the motives behind the conflict and ask, had war been declared under a cloak of conspiracy to satisfy the US's insatiable craving for oil and protect its mighty dollar?
Bush said in '99, he said, I'm going to be a war president. And because when you go to war, and he said, I'm going to go to war with Saddam, you can't be questioned.
They told me, they said, there's some strange things going on here that you need to be aware of, because some of this stuff is not going to look maybe as normal as you expect.
We could look upon the invasion of Iraq as a good thing. On the other hand, we could look at it at the beginning of World War III.
A whole load of conspiracies have been put forward to explain the Iraq War. Some are serious, some are not so serious. Was the US just lying about weapons of mass destruction so it could take control of Iraq's oil? Or was it, as some have suggested, one of the most sinister conspiracies in modern history? If it was this conspiracy, and it had failed, it could have brought the world's mightiest nation to its knees. Just 18 days after the invasion, US troops were in Saddam Hussein's capital, Baghdad. It had been a swift and vicious war, and one where President Bush was quick to claim victory. In May 2003, from the safety of his nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, he delivered a mission-accomplished speech to his troops.
In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
That speech turned out to be a touch over-optimistic. The war was far from over, and the fighting as fierce as ever. This was not the end of the war on terrorism, as had been promised, nor was it the end of hostilities in the Middle East. Back in America, as the US body count rose, some commentators were beginning to get angry. Were the people being told the truth? Behind all those confident, upbeat statements from Bush and his colleagues in the White House, was there a hidden, darker agenda to the whole campaign?
A significant percentage of Americans to this day still think that America found weapons of mass destruction.
A lot of Americans can't find Iraq on a map. They don't know anything about the world, nothing. But they got an opinion. And that bin Laden Saddam guy, he's going down.
When you're driven by, conversations with God, you start doing stupid things.
To try and make sense of some of these theories, I went to the US to find out why Americans think they went to war. Do they believe their government? Do they think the war was a conspiracy? Or are they as confused as the rest of the world? Will I find the truth of what lay behind the invasion of Iraq? I started my search by visiting one man who thinks he has some of the answers.
Big Brother, mainstream media, government cover-ups. You want answers? Well, so does he. He's Alex Jones on the GCN Radio.
This is Austin, the capital of Texas. It's home to radio chat show DJ Alex Jones. Alex's phone-in is broadcast across the whole of the US and is a good pointer to what a lot of Americans think about their country's actions.
Hello, my friends. I'm your host, Alex Jones. We're going to be here live for the next 3 hours. We have a special in-studio guest. I want to thank Simon Reeve for joining us. Simon, thank you for coming into the United States.
Well, thank you for having me.
You bet. It's nice.
Shake here.
That's right. Nice to meet you. Let's go ahead and take some calls. Who's up first here?
Hardly pausing for breath, Alex then opened the show for his listeners to give their take on the war.
John, where are you calling us from?
Las Vegas.
Welcome.
John, can I just ask him, what's your theory then about the causes of the Iraq War? Why did America invade Iraq then?
I think Saddam was going to allow the wells to flow crazy. And if you look at what's going on with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, he's been saying, hey, I'll supply the United States with lots of cheap oil. And what have you got? You got Pat Robertson and others saying we need to assassinate the guy.
Rose in South Carolina. You're on the air, Rose.
The most simplistic answer was Gary Hart saying Bush should use this incident to set up the New World Order. Well, that is the whole main theme, Alex.
Well, that's right. About 3 days after 9/11 on national TV, Gary Hart and the Terrorism Commission, Hart-Rubin Commission, got up and said we need to use this disaster for world government. I mean, we have the...
Never one to pull his punches, Alex's show is big on controversy. Larger than life, Alex is happy to offer his take on why his country went into Iraq.
Program. Trillions in oil. Number one. Trillions and trillions in oil. Hundreds of billions in weapons sales for Carlyle Group and Dick Cheney's wife on the board of Lockheed Martin and all these big aerospace giants. It's about the hundreds of billions in just non-military contracts, construction contracts, rebuilding contracts. And it's about setting up permanent military presidents and moving the main force out of Israel, out of Saudi Arabia into Iraq. And it's also then about silencing political dissent here domestically and setting up a type of military state here as well, which a lot of congressmen and prominent, even conservative leaders are now saying. We'll be right back.
The information war.
Having got that off his chest, Alex wanted more from his listeners.
Radio Network.
Let's take a call from Aaron in Texas. Aaron, you're on the air. Go ahead.
As far as the whole reason why we're in Iraq, the first one is because we're naive. We've been pampered this whole time, and now people aren't going to listen because they're afraid of the truth. They're happy with their useless dollar bills, their SUVs, their lying president, and if a few soldiers have to die, that's fine by them as long as they feel safe.
Julius in Arizona, welcome.
My take on this whole war on terror mess is it sounds too simplistic, but it's about control. There's 10 to 20 trillion dollars worth of natural gas and oil products locked up in the Caspian Sea basin. And I think this is all about control. It all boils down to who gets to ride the shiny new bicycle.
Well, I agree with you, sir, but Julian?
Callers had a whole raft of theories, from big companies lining their pockets to setting up a military state, from gaining control of oil to creating a new world order. But the one thing they all had in common was they don't believe what politicians and the media are telling them.
It's easy to dismiss some of these conspiracy theories as just people ranting. But what's really clear is that more and more Americans think their government has basically deceived them, lied to them over the Iraq War. I'm really keen to go into the causes of the conflict a little bit deeper, so I'm going to head northeast off to the center of American power in New York and Washington.
If there is a hidden agenda or conspiracy to uncover, then these two cities are where it's at. Unlike anywhere else in America, these are the places where intrigue and scheming run deep. Go! New York, the financial heart of America, is home to a growing number of people who think the war was all about money, power, and protecting the wealth and conspicuous consumption of the American lifestyle. In downtown Manhattan, I found one man who thinks he has the answer. In a word, he believes the war was about oil.
We are the largest energy consuming nation in the world. Globally, total demand is about 84 million barrels. We use in this country slightly over 20 million barrels a day. So America is dependent on oil. Unfortunately, almost 60% of the oil that we consume in this country is imported.
And that's the problem. The American obsession with huge gas-guzzling cars and an almost total disregard for conservation. And don't worry, we're not about to get diverted into global warming. That's for another story. The US used up most of its natural oil way back in the 70s, but American politicians knew what was happening and had cracked a deal with Saudi Arabia for a constant supply of their top-grade oil. In return, the Saudis were paid in dollars and arms, but the deal came at a price.
At the time, in the early 70s, oil prices were about $2 per barrel. And by 1981, oil prices, I think, reached about $42 per barrel.
But the US was actively seeking further supplies of oil, and its new president, George Bush Sr., started taking more than a passing interest in Iraq.
Iraq is a known oil province. There are no surprises there. Iraq has about 100 million barrels of known proved reserve, with the potential of doubling or tripling that.
So with America after Iraq's oil for decades, perhaps the conspiracy behind the war has its roots back in the 1980s. If it did, then blaming Iraq for 9/11 became a convenient excuse.
Imagining those 19 hijackers with other weapons and other plans, this time armed by Saddam Hussein. Take one vial, one canister, one crate, slipped into this country to bring a day of horror like none we have ever known.
The other alarming thing from the fall, beyond hearing what the president was saying, these basically lies. The president and vice president told the American people lies.
With the fighting in Iraq as furious as ever, many people are asking, was it a war to rid a country of a dictator, or was it a conspiracy to cover something else? During my travels and research, I've realized that many now believe Saddam Hussein's oil-rich Iraq had long been targeted by America. In 1991, the US, along with the coalition forces of the United Nations, swept into Kuwait to liberate it from the Iraqi invaders. Saddam Hussein claimed that Kuwait was stealing Iraqi oil. The US counterclaimed that Iraq caused that war.
The old maxim that truth is the first casualty in war, well, in the instance of 1990, truth was the first casualty even before the war, as the Bush administration tried to prepare American public opinion, world public opinion, for the legitimacy of its planned invasion.
So was America just trying to get hold of Iraq's oil during the first Gulf War? I wanted to know more. In Washington, I tracked down Brian Becker, the national coordinator of ANSWER, an influential anti-war protest group.
The Iraq War in 1991 was also a war of choice, just as the War of 2003 was a war of choice, but with slightly different objectives. In 1991, the goal was to degrade and hobble the Iraqi regime and to implode the country and to force a coup d'etat, perhaps, within the Iraqi military and political establishment so that a pro-U.S. government would take the place of Saddam Hussein.
After a short but bloody war, the coalition was at the outskirts of Baghdad. But rather than take out Hussein and occupy the capital, American and UN forces were pulled back at the last minute. For the next 12 years, sanctions were the main weapons the US and its allies used against Iraq. Principal among these sanctions was limiting its oil production, causing financial hardship.
Literally, Iraq was banned from getting just about anything. And as a result, I mean, without the ability to conduct trade, the economy degenerated, drastically throughout the 90s.
I was learning more about a possible oil conspiracy. The Canadian website Raise the Hammer is edited by Ryan McGreal. He believes that the Iraqi war conspiracy had its roots way back during those years of sanctions and is convinced that it's all about the granting of oil contracts.
During the 90s, Saddam signed several memoranda of agreement with other countries, notably France, Germany, Russia, and other countries, to come in and rebuild and develop Iraq's oil fields once the sanctions were lifted. Now, conspicuously, the United States and the UK were completely cut out of any kind of agreement.
The world had changed beyond all recognition during those 12 years. The Berlin Wall had collapsed, and with it went America's main enemy, the communist Soviet Union. And then, on September the 11th, 2001, just 9 months after a new president was sworn in, America was attacked.
Immediately, George W. Bush declared war on terrorism.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
In October 2001, the US invaded Afghanistan in a bid to smash the Taliban and al-Qaeda mastermind Osama bin Laden, who Bush held responsible for the 9/11 attacks. But after months of bitter fighting, bin Laden had still not been captured. So Bush turned his search to an old enemy of his family, Saddam Hussein.
The war on terror involves Saddam Hussein because of al-Qaeda connections, because of his history. He's a danger to the American people. And we got to deal with him. We've got to deal with him before it is too late.
They thought, when September 11th happened, perfect, great opportunity, a great excuse. If we can tell the American people that this is part of the war on terrorism, that this is somehow linked to al-Qaeda, that Saddam has nuclear weapons, then they felt they could actually manipulate the American people, their grief, their suffering, their anger in such a way to carry out something that they had been planning since 1997. And it was a perfect pretext for them, but it had nothing to do with the reality of September 11th and nothing to do with the reality of their own assertions, all of which have proved to be complete lies.
So according to this theory, 9/11 and chasing bin Laden was all a bit of a diversion. The first Gulf War against Saddam was unfinished business, and plans to invade Iraq were soon being dusted off. Less than 6 months after 9/11, deep within the Pentagon, several military intelligence experts became seriously worried about a new secret unit called the OSP, or Office of Special Plans. It seemed that it was taking too much control of the invasion planning. One of those experts agreed to talk.
I was transferred in May of 2002 into the Near East South Asia Directorate, the Middle East Directorate. I was surprised to find that the war plan for the invasion of Iraq was already on its second coordination. Okay, hold on now, guys.
Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kotowski now lives on her farm in the Shenandoah Hills in West Virginia. As a career officer for 20 years, her job had been as a political military analyst, preparing secret documents and briefings for the Pentagon.
She knows.
But after 9/11, the papers she was ordered to produce caused her a lot of concern.
There was concern that information was already being maybe misused, that there was a particular, certainly an agenda, which was the pro-Iraq war agenda, but also that information was being shaped.
By the autumn of 2002, Karen and her colleagues found that they had to obey, without question, the orders of the mysterious OSP.
We would simply call the Office of Special Plans. We would say, we have a paper due, we have a background paper, a briefing, whatever. Please give us the talking points on this subject. They would send those to us on email in a Word file, and we would take that Word file and copy the text exactly verbatim with no changes and insert it into our Word file, into our document. And that's how we were instructed to do it. It was to that level of detail. You are to copy verbatim. There will be no changes, no additions, no alterations, and no deletions. In whole, you would do that. Now,
for the regular staff officers of the Pentagon, this was not a normal way of doing things. Moreover, the shadowy OSP was being run by untrained personnel.
I think that the shared opinion, certainly my opinion, but I think it was shared by many, was that these people were remarkably unacquainted with military, security, strategy, or anything else that we do in the Pentagon.
But more disturbing to Karen was that this information became American policy and was being broadcast to the world.
Imagine those 19 hijackers with other weapons and other plans, this time armed by Saddam Hussein.
Seeing those talking points reflected in some cases verbatim in President Bush's speeches and Vice President Cheney's speeches, when we knew, compared to the intelligence, this was very misleading. We knew that this was not right.
Less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax, a little bit about this amount. UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters, and Saddam Hussein has not verifiably accounted for even 1 teaspoonful of this deadly material.
I had questions about, this seems strange, what's happening, why the rush to war? I don't understand. Intelligence doesn't support it. Why would we be so far advanced in our war planning by the summer of 2002? I mean specific war planning, invasion planning. What's really going on here? Why are we doing this? It's obviously not for the reasons that they're hinting at.
As the countdown to war began, the OSP continued to churn out the alleged misinformation.
From recent intelligence, we know that the Iraqi regime intends to declare and destroy only a portion of its banned al-Samud inventory, and that it has in fact ordered the continued production of the missiles that you see being destroyed.
The other alarming thing from the fall, beyond hearing what the president was saying, these basically lies. The president and vice president told the American people lies in the fall of 2002. Mushroom clouds, yeah, that's not true. Nowhere in the intelligence could you ever get to the point of a mushroom cloud if you stuck strictly to the intelligence. But of course, they were fabricating in order to get the American people and the Congress on board.
Finally, Karen felt she could no longer continue working at the Pentagon under those conditions. She resigned from the Air Force.
Did that make me disloyal to Rumsfeld? Did it make me disloyal to Wolfowitz and Doug Feith and Bill Luty and Dick Cheney and technically George Bush? Yes. Yes, it did. And I to this day will tell you these guys have not upheld the Constitution in any way. They have not preserved the rule of law.
In the same week that Karen left the armed services, George W. Bush's invasion force stormed into Iraq. By defeating Hussein, George Bush Jr. had done better than his dad. It appeared he'd achieved all of his promises. But once the celebrations of victory against this axis of evil country had passed, White House statements about the reasons Iraq was attacked were being forcibly challenged. High on the list were Saddam's supposed weapons of mass destruction. There were hundreds of inspections made before the invasion, and many hundreds after, but not one had produced a single WMD. Perhaps there had been a conspiracy in place to fool the American and British public all the time. For over 30 years, Alan Simpson has been active in the political world in Washington.
Obviously, they didn't go into Iraq for weapons of mass destruction, for the simple reason that the United States provided Saddam Hussein with all his weapons of mass destruction, or the precursors. So the US knew exactly what was in there. They had to pull the wool over the public's eyes.
The US knew, and we know that they knew it, that Iraq had no weapon systems, no unconventional, that is biological, chemical or nuclear weapon systems, nor had they had any probably since 1991 or 1992, because US-led weapons inspectors had carried out more than 9,000 inspections during the 1990s, going everywhere in the country with almost unfettered access. And so the Bush administration knew full well that there was no weapons of mass destruction.
With the scent of a conspiracy in the air, accusations were hurled at the US government that the conflict was an unjust war. US media and TV went crazy trying to find out why their country had invaded Iraq. And as the accusations mounted up, pressure began to build on the man in the White House.
you could argue that whilst it was a mess and is turning out to be a real mess, the intention there to seize the oil reserves for the benefit of the West was a very valid reason.
So perhaps all along the war was just about oil. Every country needs oil to survive, but the US is utterly dependent on this stuff they call black gold. Although it only has 5% of the world's population, the US uses 25% of the world's oil supplies. And now, with oil supplies dwindling, and with countries like China competing for what's left under the ground, US officials think they need to secure and control as much foreign oil as they possibly can. And most of the foreign oil that's under the ground is in the Middle East, in particular Saudi Arabia and its neighbour Iraq.
Before the war, Saddam controlled a country with a quarter of the world's oil production, containing more than 115 billion barrels of oil in reserve. Iraq was swimming in oil. It was a tempting target.
It's not accidental that the Bush administration sought the endless war project in the Middle East, because no region is more vital to the United States, meaning to the transnational corporations and to the banking elites and those who are really the captains of U.S. industry, the captains of the U.S. economy, than the Middle East, because that's where the oil is.
As the invasion forces smashed into Iraq, the stage was set for the mayhem that was to follow. All too soon, the oil conspiracy jigsaw was taking shape. By only the second day of the war, US and British troops had already captured Iraqi oil terminals. Some of these were capable of pumping more than 2 million barrels a day. It was the same story throughout Iraq. Oil fields, pipelines, refineries and pumping stations quickly came under US control.
You know, they can insist that oil had nothing to do with why they went in there, but the fact is they went in very quickly and took over the oil administration, privatized it, which it had been nationalized and is nationalized in most Arabic countries, and locked out French and German and Russian companies and gave all the contracts to British and American companies.
With nearly all of Iraq's oil fields captured, the US troops had just one more target to complete the conspiracy. On April 8, 2003, barely 18 days after the war had begun, US troops entered Baghdad. For years, the Iraqi people had suffered under a vicious and brutal dictator. In their anger, they turned on their former leader. But while hostile mobs looted hospitals and museums, the US troops turned a blind eye. They had orders to secure and hold other objectives.
Interesting that the first thing that they did was take over the oil fields, post guards around the oil ministry, and allow the hospitals and other things to be looted, which really didn't go down well. They didn't win the hearts and minds of the people.
By invading Iraq, Bush had seized all of its oil fields. Once they've been updated, production will increase to 3 million barrels a day, twice the 2002 levels. Some estimate that the final production will rise to 6 million barrels a day and threaten to undermine all other oil producers.
But if you think the alleged theft of the world's second largest oil reserves is shocking, then another conspiracy involving something called the petrodollar will really blow you away.
For years, the mighty US dollar has ruled the world. But what if Saddam did actually have a weapon of mass destruction that would not only have threatened the position of the dollar, but American military might as well?
If the dollar loses its status as a world reserve currency, that is the pillar that underpins American supremacy, then the military pillar, which is the other pillar of American supremacy, will fall away as well.
With the Iraq War supposedly over and battle raging against insurgents and terrorists, Accusations and conspiracy theories were hurled against the Bush administration. Throughout them all, the seizing of Iraq's oil was at the top of the list, even though the US and UK continued to deny it. But the price that the US is paying for its newfound black gold is reaching massive proportions. Even so, George Bush and his administration seem as confident as ever that it's a war worth fighting for, whatever the cost.
You know, I think it was bad investment because oil prices have doubled since the invasion, and yet we are spending $100 billion a year to stay in a country that it is basically close to anarchy. So what kind of improvement we have that? It's a bad investment.
Well, according to that theory, the war was all about oil and protecting expensive American lifestyles. But there's another theory that says the conspiracy goes much further than that, and that the war was actually about protecting the global supremacy of the US dollar. It should come as no surprise that the dollar is everything. The US dollar is the world's major currency. It accounts for approximately 2/3 of all the world's exchange reserves. Half the world's exports are done in dollars. All International Monetary Fund loans are made in dollars. And if you want to buy oil on the international market, the currency is the US dollar. But what would happen if some other currency threatened that position? With 12 countries already using it, and a further 15 waiting in the wings to convert to it, the euro is the fastest growing currency in the world. If the euro was to become the new international currency, the US might not take it lying down. I went to find Washington-based William Clark, an author and information analyst who believes that the conspiracy behind the Iraqi war is all about protecting the dollar.
In the early 40s, the State Department did tell the President of the United States that it looks like Middle East has more oil than the United States, and so we need, they call it the greatest strategic prize, I think, in world history.
Before this time, nearly all oil was produced by the US and sold for dollars. But by the 1970s, oil had been discovered around the world, and a cartel of 11 oil producers, OPEC, conceived a plan to sell their own oil in their own currencies. But the US had other ideas.
The United States intervened secretly in 1973 when OPEC was evaluating this proposal to say, please don't do that. And they were talking to Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and say, why don't you sell these in dollars only? And they're working closely with the British on this. And we will, it's sort of a quid pro quo, we will protect you, we will sell you military arms, we'll keep you in power, as long as you keep selling oil in dollars. Even the CIA didn't know about it at first, neither did Congress. But after the fact, it was a fait accompli, it was done. So ever since then, for the last 31 years, the dollars that OPEC gets flows back to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
That's where the problem lies. Since the agreement with OPEC, the Arab states have been controlling their own oil fields, but have still continued to sell their oil for US dollars. And where do the oil producers bank their dollars? America. It's called the petrodollar cycle.
After the petrodollar recycling system was implemented, 70% of Saudi Arabia's entire wealth was in one account in the Federal Reserve of New York. And that implemented a system where we kept the Saudis in power, they got rich, and we had an unlimited credit card.
And that's the dark side of the dollar conspiracy, and how America has been carving up the oil industry for years. It's not only the oil producers who have to sell in dollars. Buyers can only pay for oil in dollars as well. And if you don't have dollars, how do you get them? You exchange your goods and services for them. All America has to do is print them.
Japan wants to buy oil, so they make a Honda. They sell us the Honda. We give them that money, dollar bills. They take those dollar bills and they give them over to OPEC. OPEC gives them a barrel of oil. OPEC takes those dollar bills and they give it back to us in the Federal Reserve. So we print the money It goes to our trade partners. They take some of that money. Some of that money goes to buy their oil, their monthly oil bill. Saudi Arabia then invests it right back in us. That's why it's called petrodollar recycling.
As long as oil is traded in dollars and the US can print them for nothing, then it has its very own money tree. But what happens when the US cannot print those dollars fast enough to keep up with the huge amounts of imports it needs to survive? America is now importing more goods than it can pay for. So by continuing to print more and more dollars, its debt is reaching a dangerous all-time high. Even with petrodollars, it's still having to borrow from former enemies. Some believe that the once mighty dollar is now under threat. One such man, who cannot be identified, agreed to meet me at a secret address in a downtown New York hotel.
As a public servant, I'm prohibited from engaging in any political affairs, but I wanted to express my opinion about this very important subject. Just in the last year, 2005, the amount of foreign exchange reserves held by China has just exceeded the amount held by Japan. The amount of interest that was owed on previous debts of the United States is approaching $900 billion a year. China this year maybe has purchased roughly $200 billion of that. So if they stop buying, there might not be anybody to replace that $200 billion.
So perhaps it's this dependence on dollars, generated by oil, that was the reason the US went into Iraq. The whole US position in the world relies on the petrodollar. And if that should change, it could be a reason for a conspiracy to go to war.
If we have to play by the normal economic rules, we're going to have a normal-sized military, not a massive global military which is larger than the next 20 nations combined, which is what we have right now. So if the dollar loses its status as a world reserve currency, that is the pillar that underpins American supremacy, then the military pillar, which is the other pillar of American supremacy, will fall away as well.
That supremacy is also reliant on the ordinary man and woman in the street continuing to buy in US dollars.
It's American consumers who have unwittingly sown the seeds for this conspiracy. Americans are among the biggest spenders and the worst savers in the world. Buy now and pay later seems to be their motto. US national debt is now $7.7 trillion, and the entire debt of the whole country is an incredible $43 trillion. The average American now spends a record amount of their money just paying off the interest on all their loans. So if the petrodollar collapses and interest rates rise, the bubble will burst, and then the stage is set for national bankruptcy.
If that happened, that would really be catastrophic for the dollar. It would be bad enough just to have a switch into the euro little by little, but if there was any big switch of these trillions of dollars accumulated in U.S. investment, it would really be catastrophic for the U.S. economy. We may be set back more or less permanently.
When you have that many dollars unleashed, you would have a massive devaluation, massive inflation. The whole world economic order would be changed, and the United States would really be in a world of hurt.
Teetering on the knife edge of financial meltdown, the US has always needed to keep a firm hand on the trading of its oil dollars. But in November 2000, the most serious attack on the sacred dollar was about to take place. If left unchecked, it could have been an economic Pearl Harbor. After years of struggling under crippling sanctions, Saddam Hussein decided to use the one WMD that no one had ever looked for or even thought about, the euro.
There was a guy once named Saddam Hussein who said, I'm kind of mad the United States bombing me, and Britain too, so I'm going to sell oil in the euros. Came out and said that in the fall of 2000. It's a big secret here in the United States.
With the mighty dollar's position as the world #1 suddenly under threat, did a ripple of fear go through the Bush administration?
From 2001 to the very beginning of the war, Iraq exported about 3.3 billion barrels of oil. We bought 2.5 of those billion. We bought 2/3 of the oil, but we had to pay in euros. We couldn't have the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve cannot print euros. So we have to sell GMs to Europe to get the euros, or whatever we sell to Europe for goods and services in order to get the euros to buy the oil from Iraq. So the petrodollar recycling system began to break down.
So according to this theory, Saddam Hussein signed his own death warrant. President Bush had no choice if he wanted to save his country. He quickly placed Iraq on his list of axis of evil nations. And with invasion plans already in place, the inevitable soon happened.
I think the decision by Saddam Hussein to go for a petro-euro was the last straw. They had to move because the economy was threatened. And this is what you need to look at, the whole aspect of Middle Eastern oil. The economies of Europe, the economies of the United States and the economy of Britain were threatened by Saddam Hussein's decisions.
With the Iraqi oil industry firmly under US control, there was just one final task left to do to complete the conspiracy and save the dollar.
The other big secret is the first thing the Bush administration did when they took over Iraq in May of 2003 was immediately reconvert Iraq's oil transactions from the euro back to the dollar, even though from an economic perspective it was in Iraq's favor because the euro was worth about 17% more than the dollar. So he basically wiped out 17% of their entire profits by going back to the dollar.
While all this was happening, the American public was given very little information about how important oil and the petrodollars were to the US. So was there also a media conspiracy?
Absolutely. Was there a media conspiracy? Absolutely. But you have to understand how the media works in Washington. If you go against this administration, they pull your credentials tomorrow. There are some of the leading reporters have been told, you're asking the president too many hard questions. And they've been said, if you don't stop asking these hard questions, you will have your credentials pulled. If you get your credentials pulled, you don't go to press conference in the White House.
The reporters know the rules. Even those who are sympathetic and who understand the truth and the reality also recognize that should they try to project the voice or allow the voice of those who have the position not of the loyal opposition to the empire, but those who really are exposing the empire, that they will be silenced themselves.
Re-elected for a second term of office, George W. Bush seems intent on staying in Iraq and keeping control of the country's oil. The petrodollar appears to be safe, but one other country has dared challenge the US control of the black gold. After years of denouncing America as the spawn of Satan, Iran has announced that in 2006 it will set up its own oil trading exchange that could threaten the exchanges of London and New York. Worse news for Bush and his all-conquering dollar is that Iran intends to invite all of the world's oil producers to trade their oil in euros. The same scenario that happened in Iraq is beginning to repeat itself.
I'm afraid it's deja vu. This is what we've done with Iraq. Guess what? They are up for a big surprise. Iran is unlike Iraq. Population-wise, Iran is more than double Iraq. As far as the terrain and the territory, it's a harsher country. You know, it's mountainous, resistance could be incredible.
They were hoping that the invasion of Iraq would send a message to other countries that are contemplating going off the dollar standard. You know, that obviously hasn't worked out the way they intended it to. So it remains to be seen how far they're prepared to go in order to protect dollar hegemony.
And the unthinkable is already starting to happen. Saudi Arabia, which has the world's largest oil reserves, is showing an interest in switching its oil trades into euros. If Saudi Arabia makes the switch to euros, all other oil-producing countries will follow suit. Is the US going to let this happen? Is America going to stand by and let countries switch to euros, so America then loses its place as the world's superpower and loses all the money it gets in petrodollars? And if not, how far is the US going to go to stay number one?
We could look upon the invasion of Iraq as a good thing. On the other hand, we could look at the beginning of World War III.
So there you have it. From WMDs to US dollars to securing global oil supplies, everyone seems to have a take on why we went to war. Now, according to the White House and Downing Street, the war was about freedom and democracy. But according to one explanation, an alternative theory, it was a huge conspiracy designed to secure nothing less than US global supremacy.